I've created a new Q dialog or dialog without buttons, and like I said earlier, I'm just going to put the basic widgets on the screen first. We don't have a Q toolbar class available in Q dialog, so I'm going to emulate it and add a Q frame first. If you'll recall from one of the previous videos, I mentioned that Q frame is a kind of a container element which really doesn't do anything on its own. So let me add it real quick and just look for a Q frame here and drag it on the screen, and I'm going to put it in the top and expand it to span the entire width of the Q dialog. Now you can't really see it, but you can at least see the squares that denote its borders. This Q frame is going to host the three buttons I mentioned, the Facebook, Twitter, and Google Plus buttons. Now what's interesting about these buttons is that they're actually not going to be Q push buttons, but rather Q tool buttons. While these two are very similar, a Q tool button can be checkable, or in other words, it has a property that will allow it to kind of stay clicked after you click on it. They also support icons and aligning icons with the text, so they can be pretty useful. I'll add 3 of those, so let me just search for Q tool button here. And I'm going to make sure that I drag them and drop them on this frame here. Now let me resize it a little bit, and also I need to make sure to mark it as checkable in our property editor. If I scroll down, there is a checkable property. And now I'm just going to copy paste these buttons and kind of try to put them in the same space distribution here. There. Now let's do one more important thing. We should probably rename the object names of these buttons to what they actually represent. So the first one will be Facebook, the second one will be Twitter, and finally we'll have a Google Plus one. Now let me add 2 Q-line edits, so there's really nothing new here. We'll all already seen this. So make it a little bit wider. And these two, remember, will be username and password, so let's change their object names as well. Same with our Q progress bar. Let's make that one a little bit wider too. And finally we need a login button, which is just going to be our standard Q push button. And let's just change its text from push button to something more meaningful, such as login. Let's resize this so we can see it a little bit better. But overall it's pretty good. Everything's coming along nicely. We have our basic UI, and now it's our job to style it and make it at least a little bit more attractive. Okay, let's see if we can do that. So I'll start off with the Q frame at the top, not the buttons themselves, but rather the Q frame. I want to make it have a subtle gradient background. It's going to go from dark gray at the bottom of the Q frame to white at the top. To do that, I can simply right-click the Q frame and click on this Change Style Sheet. Now I'm greeted with this Edit Style Sheet dialog, and while you can definitely input just straight up CSS right here in this text box, which is what we're going to be doing for the most part, let's also look at these tools that Qt has for us when it comes to CSS. I can click this Add Gradient button here, and obviously in this case I need the background color. Now if I click on that, I'm greeted with this set of terribly looking built-in gradients, and no disrespect for the Czechs, the Dutch, or the Germans. But no worries, you can definitely create one on your own. So actually what I'm going to do is click on this black and white and click Edit button. And now you're greeted with this Edit Gradient dialog, which I can also expand by clicking this right arrow here. In this dialog, you can manipulate gradients any way you want. You can change its shape, repetition, its color, its alpha or transparency, whatever you want. The first thing I want to do is actually change the rotation of this gradient. Remember, I said I wanted my Q frame to go from dark gray at the bottom to white at the top, and currently my gradient is set from black on the left to white on the right. Now to rotate the gradient, it's very simple. I can just grab this semicircle here and then drag it to the bottom. And now we have from black at the bottom to white at the top, so half of the job is done. But to change the color, I'm first going to switch to red, green, and blue mode, or RGB mode. And then I'm going to click the semicircle here, the one below it. Once clicked, its color will show up here, and to prove that, if I click on white, you can see that it changes back on the black. Now I happen to know a nice shade of gray, so I'm just going to put 250, 250, 250, yes, it'll be gray. And then I'm also going to add it some alpha, or change its alpha from 255 to 90. Let's see, kind of add the transparency of it. Now let's hit OK. You can see that it's changed here. Let's hit OK once again. And now we have this syntax, which does look like a CSS syntax, but it has this weird Q-linear gradient here. Well, that's the way it works, at least for gradients. And as I mentioned, we're probably just going to type the CSS manually instead of using these tools, which I honestly use just when I need gradients, and really that's not that often. By the way, if you don't know CSS, you'll be happy to know that it's fairly simple to pick up and to use it actually, so please keep following along. This is not really a good example of CSS. Another thing I want to do is kind of visually separate our Q frame from the rest of the application. So I can just add a border at the bottom, and we can just type this in. So I'll do border bottom. Now let's make it 1 pixel, solid, and have a color of dark gray. A nifty little feature of this dialog is the on-the-fly CSS validator, which currently says valid style sheet because it's valid. Obviously, if it were not to be valid, for example, if I remove this semicolon here, it's going to say invalid style sheet. Put the column back in. Let's hit OK and see what happens. Well, hopefully you can see the difference. As I said, the gradient is pretty subtle, but you can definitely see this border at the bottom. But what's this? Did our Qtool buttons change? Yeah, they did. The container element passes along any CSS properties it has to whatever element it contains, which in this case are our 3 buttons. Luckily, this is a very simple fix, so I'll just edit the same style sheet again by right-clicking the Q frame and selecting Change Style Sheet. And now the simple fix is just wrapping these CSS properties within a Q frame selector. Make sure I add the curly brace at the end. And now if I click OK, you can see that the buttons are styled, have their default style, while the Q frame still has that gradient and the border at the bottom. I think this looks a lot better. But the next ones down the line for styling are our Qtool buttons, and we want them all to have the same look and feel. So for that reason, it would kind of seem silly to edit the CSS just for one button and then copy the entire CSS and paste it for the second one, the third one. And imagine if you had 10 buttons and you wanted to change just one property and you have to go do it all over again. Well, luckily we can just edit the QFrame style sheet, but target just the Qtool buttons that it contains. You can do that by using the Qtool button selector, just as I use QFrame here. Now, in the interest of saving time, I'm just going to paste the CSS I already have and explain it exactly what property does what. So let me paste it first and go back to the top. So here we have a Qtool button where I'm telling it to have the background color of transparent, in other words, don't have a background color, a border of none. You can see that the background color has this kind of a grayish shade, and we have a border of darker grayish shade. Down below, I just changed these properties, but only in 2 specific states. If the Qtool button is checked, or in other words, if it's clicked, or if it's pressed. And pressed would be when you click on it and do not release the mouse button yet. So you can see here how the text, for example, in this Add Color button, sinks in when I click on it, and then once I release or move my mouse away, it's going back to its normal position. The Qtool button Hover changes the background color when I hover my mouse, just like it does right here. And then we have the Qtool button Checked Hover. So when the Qtool button is checked and then we hover the mouse, it's also going to change the background color. I'm going to hit OK. And yes, the buttons look like they disappeared, but they blend in much better. And if I hover, you can see that this kind of nice bluish shade shows up. And if I preview the application, I can click on it and make it checked, and you can see that this darker blue border has showed up. And if I hover over it, we still have that same color that I specified. Can uncheck it, can do all this fancy stuff with it. Now before we move on, let me show you a little trick that can be very useful. Imagine you have these 3 or even more buttons in one queue frame, and you want them all to have the same style except for this one button that's out there. Now you can change the style sheet of just that one button, but you can also do this. I'm again going to edit the style sheet for the queue frame. Then down below, I'm just going to type this, queue tool button, and then the pound key or the pound sign, and let's target the Facebook button. I can add its border to say, for example, border 1 pixel solid red. Now, if you know CSS and HTML, you've probably seen this before. This is the way you target a specific ID in your HTML page. And what's unique in the Qt? Well, the object name, of course. We have our Facebook object name for our first button, and if I hit apply, you can see that just this Facebook button has a 1 pixel solid red border. Let me get rid of that for now. Okay, so we're done with our toolbar. Let's move on and style the rest of the elements.